Howdy everyone, Poultry here with an Age of Magic video, and in today's video we're going to look at the history of the game, specifically the most influential heroes to ever be released into the game's meta scene from the beginning to now. With over 170 heroes currently in the game, there have definitely been some that have outperformed what they were meant to, whether by design or by mistake, and we are going to cover those in this video. Keep in mind though, the game has been out for years and I might miss one or two along the way, so if you remember a specific hero being released that completely changed the way things were happening at the time, by all means leave a comment below. I will be focusing on heroes specifically and not factions. I feel like that could be a video in itself. So let's get into it and let's go right back to the beginning. The first hero to really impact the meta of the game was the first ever event hero released, Rock. He completely changed every team being used because simply if you had him, you were putting him in your team. The game was extremely different back then as well. It was a game where there was no such thing as factions. Factions existed, but there was no synergy in factions. You didn't have heroes that, for example, had a ability that increased the chances of working if they had other heroes from the same faction in the team. That wasn't a thing. Every hero was independent. They worked independently. I think there were maybe one or two, like Schnee, for example, who could buff other kobolds. But overall, every team you came across in Arena, for example, and in a tournament, was a mix mash of heroes. You'd have Arakan Guard, Arakan Spear, Arakan Axoa, Tanita. He was very prominent in the scene at the time. And Hargrim was a very popular character as well. It was just a mix of everything. You were just finding whatever worked. The game was raw. People didn't really understand what was going on at the time. And then Rock came along. And he had a full team stun. And he was one of the fastest heroes to be released at the time. And he became the most important hero in the game. And what people found, and it's probably one of the only times I can ever say this, was with Rock's release, Worm Priest became very, very viable. Now, the reason for this was because at the time of the game, the health, attack, and defensive heroes was weighted differently to what it is now. The damage seemed far more impactful, and when I say that, you consider the damage heroes do today against enemies or whoever you're versing, that damage is normally backed up by a lot of synergy within the faction or the team you're using. You've got your leadership abilities, you've got your passives, like every hero has a passive now. You've got awakenings. None of that existed at Rock's release. Damage was pure and it was impactful, and it needed none of that stuff behind it to make it impactful. So Rock came along, he had a full team stun, and then we had Worm Priest, who again, was probably implementing the first real use of marks in the game, would eventually come along and be able to apply the caster mark, which gave guaranteed crit to a caster, and then Rock would come along with his Fire Blast, or Fireball, whatever it's called, Fireball, and it would do tremendous damage to the point of just wiping out the enemy. Now, with the team-wide freeze and other heroes in the faction, it was quite easy to get this to work. You could never get it to work today. But it was the first time we saw something really impactful in the game, and it cemented Rock as a meta hero for a long period after that as well. A little while after that, we were introduced to the first big release of heroes into the game. And again, things worked differently back then to how they do now. We weren't getting one hero at a time. The Barbarians were, on the most part, released as a whole faction into the game. I believe we got Danaea, Swamp Killer, Silvermoon, Atiles, and Aratar in one big release. I believe, from memory. Maybe one of those was already in the game, but they all came out at the same time. And amongst them was, of course, Swamp Killer. Now, you look at Swamp Killer today, you probably don't expect too much of her as a hero. She's pretty neat. With Clan Battles released, she did get a little bit of a buff. But looking at this hero's kit, you're probably wondering, why was she so impactful? And it was because of one thing that isn't in the game today. If we look at Swamp Killer's skills, her basic Disemboweling is a pretty simple ability. It performs a melee physical attack on the target, pretty standard stuff. And then we have a second ability, Killer Strike. Deals 2 physical hits to the target with a 60% chance of dealing damage, has a 100% chance of casting the rogue mark on the target. Now here was the fun thing about Swamp Killer. Because she dealt 2 physical hits, each hit had a chance of applying the rogue mark. So if you were lucky enough to apply the rogue mark on the first hit, then the second hit would then trigger the rogue mark and put the target to sleep. This was creating an endless cycle of keeping the mark on the target and keeping the marked target asleep. Comes your next point. How did that work, however, when Swamp Killer's ability is a cooldown ability? That's the thing. It wasn't a cooldown ability. When Swamp Killer was first released, Killer Strike, this ability, this description, the way this works was her basic ability. It had to get swapped later on in the game because people were using her too much. Her basic ability was the only ability people were using, and they were using Swamp Killer purely to lock one hero down on the enemy team. You were essentially making the fight a 5v4 off the bat, because due to Swamp Killer's extreme speed, and at the time, there were not many heroes that competed with her speed, and the majority of heroes in the meta scene, sometimes Swamp Killer would get another turn before they got their first turn. So this became the only ability people would use on her. It would lock the enemy target down, whoever you chose to target, and because she's a rogue, she also did really good damage. So she wasn't just locking someone down and keeping them locked down and not really doing anything else about it. She was locking them down and quite effectively killing that target as well. She would almost just... It was the old school version of hit list. She would apply her own hit list to a target, and that target was dead. There was not much you could do about it, and it being a mark, not a debuff, there was not much you could do to prevent it either. So eventually, Playcott removed her Killer Strike from her basic and moved it to her special ability, gave it a cooldown, and it didn't kill Swamp Killer. It definitely didn't kill her, but it definitely removed her as a prominent hero in the scene. The next impactful heroes I'm going to place together because in the test server, the order in which these heroes were released were very close together. They were 10 heroes apart from each other, I believe. And to be honest, I believe these 3 heroes definitely set the foundation for what was known as the Holy Trinity at the time. It was a group of heroes that created the perfect meta. There were 3 meta teams, and each one countered each other. So there was the Rogue Squad, which countered the Bomb Squad. There was the Bomb Squad that countered the Healing Squad, and the Healing Squad, which countered the Rogue Squad. So it was a really nice synergistic time, is that a word, of the game. It was probably one of the best times I've ever had in Age of Magic. I class it as the golden era. I think there was so much variety in the game and it made a lot of sense. These 3 heroes offered so much when they were released because we hadn't ever seen heroes that could do so much in their kits. First of all, we had Lucky, who offered the best healing in the game at the time. Her healing offered defensive bonuses as well. She could resurrect. I believe the resurrection cooldown was lower than Karana's. So she was at the time a better Karana, and people started to use her a lot. Next came Azariel, who though did not have as good of healing as Lucky, she was, I want to say, not unkillable, but she was tough to beat. She was tough as nails, and she offered the first death immunity to the game we'd seen as well. Now, why she was so tough is because at the time, healers were really dominant. People were running 2, even 3 healers in a team at the same time. Then came Azariel, who could just benefit from all that healing. You would try and take her out. It was close to impossible because your team had to rely on the healing because the enemy was obviously going for your healers, and the moment one of those healers fell, the team would crumble apart. So you would constantly be healing to keep your healers alive, and Azariel would be the solo healer on the enemy team, and she would just be benefiting from this healing. She would just keep healing and healing and healing, and you just couldn't kill her, while everyone else on her team just went to work. So she really, really leeched on to the healing meta at the time, and it benefited her, and just she really worked off that. Then came Siegfried. I think Siegfried was more impactful to the game than Magnus, if you put them side by side. He came into the game and he had an instant taunt. Now, another thing I want to mention about these three heroes and what made them really, really powerful was at the point of the game at the time, there weren't a lot of heroes in the game that could control buffs. You couldn't really cleanse buffs, purge buffs. Buffs were just there. You had to deal with them. So I'm not saying it was impossible to get rid of them. It just wasn't in every hero's kit like it is today. So, when you start off with a taunt, the enemy can't really get rid of that. There are very few heroes that could do that. And, when Lucky got her healing off, you couldn't just get rid of the hot on the characters it was applied to. So they were almost guaranteed to get the healing. Azariel's death immunity, you couldn't really just get rid of it. She was gonna, no matter what, protect an enemy or an ally from death. And with this, like I said, came the three Trinity squads, the Holy Trinity. We had the Rogue squad, which benefited from the Swamp Killer and the Succubus, and I think it was Archon Shadow, and you'd throw two healers in there, or you'd throw Siegfried in there. Then you would have the Holy Trinity, the Healing squad, which would be Lucky, Karana, I think it was. I'd have to go. It was such a long time ago, but it was such a wonderful time of the game. And then you'd have Siegfried, who, like, for example, the Bomb squad, who had characters that needed to be protected, he would protect them and allow you to set up the bomb that would just blow up the enemy. So they were very impactful. They almost created the Holy Trinity meta that we knew at the time. And, I mean, mostly forgotten these days, but to me, they will always have a very, very dear place in my heart. After the golden age of the Holy Trinity, we had a big shift in the meta squad of the game. Came the Archons, and that was the first heavily influenced faction-based team. Wiped out a lot of what we knew from the game. There were a few counters, and amongst that, like I said, I don't want to focus on factions that changed the game, so I don't really want to talk about the Archons. That could be a different video. But amongst the release of the Archons in that period of time came Rhiannon. This was the big battle between the Dark Elves and the Archons. The Dark Elves were very much overshadowed by the Archons. They were performing way too good for their time. And we got this gem, Rhiannon. Now, Rhiannon was one of the first heroes in the game that had a huge buff removal potential, and it instantly gave him a lot of value. People were trying to use him in a lot of squads. The most well-known squad people placed him in was Blue Artis. They put him in the Archon team because he didn't carry the dark sigil of the Dark Elves. He is considered a light hero, so he was placed into the Archon team, and he was very, very dangerous. He was able to apply the boss mark, worked with Artis, but it was the buff removal that was huge. It was massive, and because it was an AoE, like I said, its value in a game where buffs weren't really contested too much made him such a great hero. And I believe it definitely, he may not have dramatically changed the meta, but he definitely added a lot of value to himself simply because of what he could do, and he was by far one of the most valuable heroes at the time. Now, looking at the heroes released between Rhiannon to Iriz, there's nothing that really stands out. If I'm mistaken, by all means let me know, but Iriz seems to be the next hero that really changed the meta of the game. I think Iriz definitely outperformed far more than she was expected to. She introduced the first mechanic into the game where we saw, I believe it was the first time we saw it, where damage from the enemy was reduced to a static percentage. The enemy damage could not exceed 5% of the target's max HP, which was huge. It was the biggest damage nullifying ability in the game by a long shot. And she could apply this stat not just to the bugs of the game, but to anyone on her team. It was huge. It instantly took her to the top of the meta. And I'm not saying she was beating meta squads with really good heroes because of this buff. she was beating meta squads with the bugs, which were arguably some of the, if not some of, they still are some of the worst heroes in the game, simply because of when they were released in the game. You compare the skill descriptions of the Ra Arachne compared to what's released today, or even what was released at the time of Iriz's release, they scale in comparison of what they can do. However, with this one hero, she brought the whole faction up to the top. There are several videos I did at the time where I could just beat them simply just by reducing all the damage the enemy was doing. Not only that, she could ramp up the damage because every time you were attacked, you would get a damage buff stack. And that racked up high enough, you could just one-shot enemy characters. Iriz still can do that, but she has been nerfed, and quickly after, heroes started to come out that could completely counter this one damage reduction ability. The biggest known one was Thanar, who simply just does more damage to the enemy if the enemy has this buff on them. And not Librarian, I apologize. I think it was Tristan. Tristan, who was already in the game at the time, received a rework to again counter this ability. So it was a really big deal. This character caused a lot of problems to the meta. It caused a lot of problems to the release of heroes because no matter the faction being released at the time, Iriz was a counter to them. And the bugs were a counter to the strongest, newest, flashiest heroes at the game, and Playcott just needed to stomp that bug out. And they did. Iriz herself is still a wonderful hero. Her prevalence in the game has definitely increased since clan battles. 6v6, she's a wonderful hero to use because, again, of the damage reduction buff she can apply. And yeah, it's good to see her being used still to this day. But if she was what she was when she first came out, she would still be a top meta hero by far. The things she could do, whew, it was scary. Now I really, really wanted to throw Rhiannon in here because she is one of the few heroes that has impacted the game hugely, not revolving around PvP. It's always PvP. When there's a big swing in the meta, when people are frustrated, it's normally to do with PvP. And things get overlooked when good characters come out that help in other areas of the game. Rhiannon was such a staple hero for Raid 5 at the time, that, or regular Raid, whatever you want to call it, the Raid before Nightmare. She just boosted everyone's ability to get through that raid. And I think to this day, she is still going to be a very valuable character for people leveling up in the game. I personally wouldn't go out of my way to collect her shards, but for some reason, if you open a bunch of chests and you get a bunch of Rhiannon shards, you can easily mix her into any meta squad and use them in that old raid, if that's where you are up to in the game. Because of her leadership or her passive ability. The second last dot point, raid only, increases maximum HP of all allies by 40%, and then the third last dot point, at the end of the round, reduces the timer of all allies' special skills by 3. So for those very new people watching this video, for some reason, the way raid works is you verse waves of enemies, normally 2 to 4, and when you enter a new wave, the health of your characters, the cooldown on your skills, they all carry over. So you normally go into a new wave at a little bit of a disadvantage. With Rhiannon, however, with that passive ability, you were going into a new wave and all your abilities were pretty much reset. So it made most teams viable in that old raid setting where you could use any heroes you want. And I think it definitely helped a lot of people. She was a very valuable hero, and she definitely shaped raid teams in that part of the game. PvP-wise, not very impactful at all, but like I said, it's not all about PvP. Raid-wise, one of the most impactful heroes ever released. The time has come. You all knew he was going to be in the list. Myrddin. I think Myrddin was one of the most powerful heroes ever released into the game. And to be honest, I went back to look for his spotlight video to compare to what he was to what he is now, because he did get nerfed. I cannot find the video. I cannot find an official spotlight video I did on this character, so I can't actually compare to what he used to be. But he used to be an absolute menace. He was probably the hero in the game I saw the most complaints about to this day. And I'm comparing that even to the Chaos Spawn. The Chaos Spawn have been a very powerful faction in the game, in arena and tournament, but I honestly don't believe I've seen more complaints about a hero than old school Mordred. From memory, I believe his what do they call it? Sorry, I have to have a look. I always forget. Polymorph into Distorted. The Distorted. I believe the Distorted ignored Fortification. I'm pretty sure it was almost guaranteed to land. There were very few cases where it didn't, like bad luck. But on the most part, it was gonna polymorph one of your heroes. I believe the initiative manipulation was a lot more toxic, I want to say. And I believe he could do a lot more with his basic as well. I believe his basic, every strike, I believe his basic could reduce more initiative as well. Honestly, I've blocked him out of my mind, what he used to be able to do. I'm sure there are people out there that know. If you know, leave a comment below. The information I have on this character is surprisingly scarce on how dominant he was in the game. I thought I'd have a lot more videos out there on him. A lot of my videos, I think, are trying to beat this character over trying to use this character. So, but he is new enough that I think the majority of players still remember the impact he had on the game. And it was the age of Mordred. It was the age of Mordred for a long time. And it's not so much now. He's not really used all too much. I believe you may start seeing him in a Renegade team. However, with Felicia now being able to distort almost an entire enemy team, I don't think you will see Mordred all that too often. But he's always a great character to have on reserve, especially for clan battles. And being a rogue, you can mix him in with a rogue team as well with your Swamp Killer. So still a very, very powerful hero. But I think Playcott did the right thing in nulling him a little bit in terms of what he could do, because it was all people were seeing at the time, and solutions to this character were far and few, and we were desperately after a way to combat him. Now, between Mordred and Corvis, there aren't too many heroes, again, that stand out as an individual hero that really impacted the game. Again, I could be missing someone. There's a lot of heroes, there's a lot of things happening in the game. Like I said, if there's a hero specifically that stood out to you, that changed the way you played the game, or brought great fear when you saw them on the enemy team, leave a comment below. I would love to know. But I do want to end the video on Corvis. Now, we know Corvis right now is one of the most powerful heroes in the game because he's behind or backed by some of the most powerful characters in the game. The most powerful team in the game, in my personal opinion, at the moment is Corvis, Lola, Felicia, Devourer, Void Gunner. And this video isn't about meta teams that are impacting the game. It's about individual heroes. But in my last stream, someone brought up a very interesting point about Corvis, which I think is definitely going to be intriguing to see how people utilize this. And if you're not aware, I may bring it to your attention now, and you may be able to experiment with it yourself and come up with something that breaks the game. If we look at Corvis and we look at his leadership ability, specifically the second dot point, damage to Dark Allies is reduced by 15% for every dragon token on Corvis. Now, as much as everything in this character's kit is based around demons and renegades, this one dot point extends to all dark heroes. So, you can throw any group of dark heroes together, get your Corvis to 5 stacks, and that team instantly becomes a wall. They take 75% damage reduction, allowing you to come up with some really nice synergies between characters you're probably not expecting, because they're not going to be eliminated the moment the battle starts. Corvis is almost guaranteeing you a chance to experiment with dark heroes and come up with something very exciting. This was brought to my attention by Lolaris Very creative mind. Love when he's in my streams because he comes up with some of the most ingenious ways to use characters. And this was definitely one of, I believe this was one of his. I hope it was one of his. I'm giving the credit to him. But personally, I would love to experiment with this. I'm thinking of 6v6 in clan battles and creating a full dark team. But bringing it to everyone's attention is just going to open up the window for lots of different people to experiment with this hero. I understand everyone has this character at different levels of power because he's quite an exclusive hero, but just getting the idea out there might be enough for some people to come up with some really unique and game-breaking teams that we haven't seen yet. There we go. Those were the most, from memory, impactful characters in the game since its inception. If there's anything that stood out to you, like I said, let me know. Would love to hear from you. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below. I will answer it to the best of my ability. And wherever you're on the world, until next time, please take care of yourself.